Welcome to the MR Runningpains podcast, or welcome back to the MR Runningpains podcast. My name is Aaron Saft. Today I have with me Coach Patrick Reagan. Patrick is just an all-around awesome person. He's a great runner. He's a great coach, great friend, just great person to know. I hope you take a lot away from this conversation as we talk about the Grand Slam and training for the Grand Slam or a 100-miler. Or just training in general. There's just so much packed into this episode that hopefully you can take away from. So if you have questions for either of us, our contacts are going to be in the show notes. But like I said, grab a pencil and paper because you're going to take away a lot from this episode. And I thank Patrick for his time. I'll catch up with you guys at the end of the episode. So please enjoy my conversation with Patrick Reagan. Mr. Coach Patrick Reagan. It's Mr. Coach Patrick Reagan. How are you?
That. I'm doing pretty well, buddy. I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh man, it's always good to see you and share these conversations. I like that we both started with a smile. We were just talking how these podcasts sometimes can be just a little too serious. So it's a good way to start. So, Mr. Patrick, tell us a little bit more about you and what you've been up to, because you've been on the podcast before, but you've been up to quite a few things. So let's hear about it.
Yeah, so I did my first race of the fall. First 100 I finished this year. I did Javelina. So I was really buried in the training process for that, like most of us get. And once I got through, I got to kind of take a little break from running and focus back in on, coaching all the athletes I work with. I just got a chance to travel to Desert Solstice. Yeah, it's been pretty fun this year to support all the athletes I'm working with.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I mean, very relevant in our conversation today for sure. But talk a little bit about what that was like for you. Going into Javelina, kind of the first time getting back in the mix. Great field, always a great race. It's such a cool setting, and that's I'm sure why you keep going back. So just talk a little bit about the race and how that was, what it meant to you and how you took and interpreted your results.
Yeah. I mean, Javelina for me has been a race that is quite special, having won 3 times in a row. And the question was, why go back? Right. That I'd got once I'd entered, and it was more of a homecoming for me that I got to go back to where I learned to run the 100-mile distance, to a race that is very special to me in terms of the atmosphere, the race directors, having a bit of a personal relationship with Jamil and Jubilee, and just enjoying that setting for sure. It's easy to train for here in Savannah, being that it's a hot weather race. And it felt like I was kind of reestablishing myself, given that I was coming off a DNF earlier in the year, and wanting to just get a nice, clean finish. I don't know if I so much had a perfect day out there, so much as it was empowering to have like my community around me, some athletes that I coach. My wife was there. My good friend, Nicole, who's like my partner in the coaching business, was there. So we had this day that not everything went perfectly. And that's part of being an athlete and weathering the storm. I think that made it maybe even all the more special to have a day that I trained really hard for this event. It wasn't a perfect result for me, but it felt very good to get to the finish line, And as we age as ultra runners, it's nice to think back on results and say, well, this is where I was and this is the runner I am now. These are the problems I'm having today, and how do I navigate those? So in post, I guess that's the way I'm looking at it, is maybe I've got a long way to go to get back to exactly where I want to be as an athlete, but it feels good to power through and finish on a day that wasn't ideal.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because I think a lot of times, especially at the 100-mile distance, we have this vision, right, of this perfect race, and the reality of that coming to fruition. There's just so many external factors that I think if we crossed the line and we didn't meet expectations, that sometimes we get down on ourselves, and perhaps we shouldn't. And I like the fact that you're taking away that maybe it didn't go according to plan, but when you look at it, you can say, well, maybe I wasn't quite where I wanted to be, but I'm going to do the steps necessary to get there. Because sometimes we don't look at these races as a stepping stone, especially as a first 100-miler. I think sometimes people look at the first 100-miler and they just expect a finish, that can be just the goal, is just a finish, and they don't, and that's a hard reality, is, training for something and not getting it finished. But I think if they can take away things and learn things from why they didn't finish, that might be even more powerful to help them finish the next time. So I think there's a lot of what you just said that people can take away and say, maybe this didn't go according to, and it doesn't have to be 100-miler, it can be any distance, but that's a really, good mindset to kind of take away from this. So I appreciate that, that openness about it.
And it's a bit easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at my track at that race in particular, to be honest, I think, well, I won. It's going to be hard to duplicate that, especially in a golden ticket race and the type of field we had. So I had to almost go in with quite reasonable expectations. I knew on a perfect day, I could compete because I've competed there in the past, but I have to go in thinking, this is the runner I currently am. And maybe Jonathan Rea, Dakota Jones, Matt Daniels, that maybe they are fitter than me right now. So I have to be careful and tactical, right? To not bite on the race they want to run early on, but run my race, stay focused on myself, listen to the signals my body's giving me. I think it's even harder in post to look at the result I had, Aaron, and say, I'm really happy with that. It's difficult, right? I actually probably more look at it and have kind of those post-race blues like you're talking about, right? Where it's like, man, I know that could be 2 hours faster, right? But if we look at it that way, it's going to be discouraging from even getting back into the next training block. And I think the more important thing is to look at it and say, I got to finish. I'm pretty happy with that. And I know for a lot of people, the time I ran would be a dream time, right? That would be maybe for 60% of the ultra running population, even 70, like that time is difficult to achieve, right? Even 80%, 90%. So I don't want to complain about, a couple hours off of a 13-hour time. I'm actually just pretty happy to still be doing this. This is really fun. It's awesome that I get to do this professionally. And that's the way that I'm trying to look at it. Although when I'm by myself, maybe not on a podcast with you, I look at the result and it affects me a little differently. Right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we were talking beforehand about, your pre-race, interview for the race itself. I think what would be most, utilizing for folks is actually a post race, right? Like, how did it go? Like, what were the takeaways? Because that's, I think, what we need to analyze more so. We go in with a plan, but then when we come out, what are we using moving forward? What's the plan moving forward? How do we plan to improve, right? Like, what were your takeaways? What were the positives? What went right? What were the negatives? What went wrong? What can you work on? That's, I think, what a lot of times we're so frustrated, by a performance that it didn't go the way we wanted to. We neglect to take those things into account. And how do we move forward and improve upon them? We let them hinder us rather than allow us to grow. So, taking those things, and it hurts. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. It's just, how do you move through it and understand that this is a process? And I think that's where we'll find the most growth.
Definitely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think if we had more post-race interviews with athletes in the sport and on podcasts where the race didn't go perfectly, we would probably understand the average general psyche of the ultra running population, where it goes perfect for very few runners in any given race. Right.
Yep.
But like most media sources athletically, I think ultra running often says to us, what have you done for me lately? I mean, I hadn't done a podcast for 4 or 5 months. And then I had 5 or 6 requests, right? Because I was going into Javelina, not to accuse anyone, but I think we could use more media from people that are in rough patches if they were willing to do so. I'm going through injury, but here's how I'm working through it. I mean, I think that would be super valuable.
Right. It exposes vulnerability, which none of us are really good at doing. That's the hardest thing, is to allow yourself to show your vulnerabilities. But again, that's where we're going to find growth, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, that said, it's, this distance, it does a lot to us. Not only does it do things mentally, however the outcome, positive or negative, physically, it takes a toll on us. And as you said, you got to take a break and take a step back. But what are we looking at? Just so folks understand, not everybody's run 100 miles. Some people run a marathon, and that's great, and that takes a toll. But if we're looking at the 100-mile distance, what toll does that take on us?
Yeah. So now we're getting into our topics for the day. I love it. Today we're going to focus on the 100-mile distance and kind of what it takes to not only do well at it, but also to recover from it. And how do we apply it to this adventure that you're about to go on too, right, Aaron?
Right.
So for me, the 100-mile distance is a huge tax on the endocrine system, right? Whether I'm working with myself or working with one of the athletes that I coach, no matter what that level that athlete is at, if they're a pro or if they're a newcomer to the 100-mile distance, we need to respect the tax that you will have in post on the body. Through the 50-mile mark or so, it's not different from running a 50-mile race. Okay. But there's something that happens between the 100K mark and the 100-mile distance that undoubtedly you're going to be tapped out in ways you haven't been before, if you haven't done the distance before. But even if you are a seasoned runner, right, you are going to need a significant number of days off after the event, especially if it's the second 100-miler you've done in a year and it's at the very end of your season. I always recommend, much like, and this is advice I'd got from Pam Smith pretty early on in doing 100-mile races, taking a day off of running for every 10 days racing is really important. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be active, but that's a good baseline start for me personally to just immediately know I'm not going to be running for 10 days. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to go out for a 45-minute bike ride or go walk my dogs for an hour with a 20-pound weight vest, right? Just move. Doing 2 or 3 miles of walking per day is my usual approach. That's kind of my baseline. And I go from there. Even the first 2 or 3 days after, though, I'm almost doing absolutely nothing, taking time completely off, maybe a little bit of mobility work, lots of water therapy, right? Whether it's a hot tub or Epsom salt baths, maybe a little massage therapy. So you almost like have to give up immediately. I'm not going to be running for 10 days. That's a good starting place. Now, we're talking mostly in post, but the why of that is you're out there for an absurd amount of time, number one. But after the 100K mark, no matter who you are beating yourself up, right? We're loading all of our body weight onto our joints. Oftentimes we're getting massive trauma, like in the ankles and the feet, right? In these races, if the ankles and feet are destroyed, then like it's going to be difficult when our ground contact point is beat up in such a way that if your ground contact point is beat up, you're not going to be able to train in the aftermath, right? So more than anything, it's the endocrine system that I care about, along with like soft tissues and harming something because the mobility down the chain isn't where I want it to be. So for me, the usual problems come in the lower leg after the 100-mile distance, right? Like my feet are usually a little swollen. I don't have great mobility at the ankle because I'm a mid-foot, 4-foot runner. So in the soleus and in the calf, I'm not in a good state either. So how could I expect to not strain something or hurt something if I went and jogged? So that's the reason that I usually completely back off for those 10 days. Right on.
Yeah. Because it also, I mean, we talk about how much the lack of our ability to supply our body with the nutrients it needs, with the caloric demand that it has. We're going to caloric deficit. So, at that extent too, our body totally needs to recover, and that's going to take some time too. Down to the cellular level, we've kind of stressed the whole system, like you talked about, our endocrine system, but it's really our whole body, down to the cellular level, that we've really created all of this stress and trauma within the systems. So it's going to take time for that to catch back up and recover. It will. We just have to give it the time, and that way we can resume and stay healthy. Because if we try to push back and get back too early, the potential for injury is just too high. And I think that's one of the things that folks just aren't quite good at is just taking that time to let the body recover. Because like you, I say, well, let's take the time to recover from this, and that's the hardest thing for people. Like one of the reasons being is they're like, well, I'm going to lose so much fitness. Do you want to touch on that subject for a moment?
Yeah, I think related to this subject, like Zach Bitter has some great content where he will post what he does each day in post to 100-mile distance, or in terms of what he's doing literally each day in the aftermath of the 100-mile race. Day one, I'm working on some ankle mobility. And it might be just a short 30-second video, but you need to be extremely specific to what you're finding is working for you. In terms of what you're doing each day in the aftermath. Am I answering the question here?
Yeah, I think you are.
I think that the recovery process is individual, and it depends on what you're sensing. Like, what are you sensing this time, having run a 100-mile race or your first 50K versus the last time, right? Where are you having discomfort? Are you having just general trauma and pain, or are you having just like general trauma, or are you maybe on the pain scale, or do we need a month this time? I think that pivoting each time you do a race and doing things a little bit differently in posts are really important, because just because last time you didn't get hurt like acutely or chronically and at the 100-mile distance, this time around you might need to be even more patient, right? This might be a 30-day process. This might be a 60-day process where you gradually work yourself back into running, because not only did you do a 100-mile race, but you had a really long season. So, I encourage, getting involved in different activities after the 100-mile race, as opposed to just thinking, how can I get back to running as quickly as possible? I think it's really healthy to have a bit of an off season too, right? Getting on a gravel bike, right? Getting on skis or snowshoes in particular area, if you have that type of weather. So develop a general process, but also be willing to pivot off of your usual tactics too.
Yeah. And regards to, the general fitness, if we're looking at how much fitness do we lose by taking off this time, it's minuscule. And, I want to stress that point too, is because that's what sometimes people get hung up on is, they've reached this peak of fitness and they're worried about losing that fitness. But the actual amount of fitness that is lost by taking off this minuscule amount of time is in itself very, very small. So, just to reiterate, the time off, it's going to benefit you in the long haul, because the amount of fitness that you lose in that time off will come back, and then you'll actually grow from there. Your fitness you can actually take on more fitness by taking the time off and allowing the body to recover so that it can take on more stress and a larger workload.
Yeah. And let's think of it this way too. You may lose 5, 8, 10% of your general aerobic fitness in the 10 days after or 2 weeks after doing absolutely nothing. But you're also absorbing stimulus from one of the most important long runs you've ever done, which in the grand scheme of things, you have a greater potentially aerobic potential after that, and also a greater understanding of getting better at the 100-mile distance in the future, right? If you are patient in the 14 days after. Like I've made big mistakes. I've pushed back into training 5 or 6 days after my first 100-mile race. And then I was on a spin bike for 4 or 5 months in 2018, right? After I did my first javelina, I just got back into things too quickly. I was excited about it. I'd got invited to Western States that year. It was going to be my first Western States, and I wanted to get to business as quickly as possible. And I wish at that stage I'd have already been working with Magda or Ian Sharman, right, as an advisor, as a coach, to tell me, patience. There's plenty of time for Western States, right? Like you don't really need to get in the thick of things till mid-March. But that's one of the main mistakes we can make, is getting back into things too quickly and then not allowing our bodies time to absorb that massive amount of stimulus. And if our endocrine system is already super taxed, right? And from a cellular standpoint, we could push ourselves into severe overtraining, red S, create a whole world of problems that are acute and problematic, where we cannot get back into the next training block to see the fruition of that huge stimulus being absorbed. Right.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the training for a 100-miler. Let's say in the amount of time, if we're talking weeks, how long do you typically look at a typical training cycle for 100 miles? What's your typical, this many weeks is probably ideal for training for a 100-miler?
It's heavily dependent on whether or not the runner has done 100 miles before. And it's also heavily dependent upon what your general fitness is going into that training block. So if we're talking couch to 100-miler, it's a much longer process than I did a 50K earlier this season. I did a 50-miler earlier this season. Now I'm 10 weeks from my 100-miler. 10 weeks should be enough, right? Mm-hmm. But if you look at the training block as though I'm going to do 200 milers this year or 100 miler this year, why not stretch it and look at it more as a 24 or 36 week training block? And the training block being a process, kind of a traditional process that runners would use for an event like Western States, where they'd get their training started again in mid to late December. They'd flow into something like Way Too Cool 50K at the beginning of March. They do American River 50-miler at the beginning of April. They might do one more 50K in May, and then they do Western States in June. So what I'm looking at there is, like, let's call it 28 weeks or 30 weeks. I think that's a healthy amount of time for you to focus on one big A goal if you're a busy working professional. We often hear on podcasts people talk from the professional standpoint. Well, I like to do 300 milers a year or 200 milers a year. And I look at the training block as 16 weeks. But I think most people need to look at it in more macro terms of, this is the amount of time I have to train per week. I'm training less than professional runners. I think a healthy amount of time is to look at the year in two phases, Aaron, where we have 24 weeks for phase 1, 24 weeks for phase 2. And let's be honest, everybody needs maybe 4 weeks off a year, right?
Right.
That's the other 4 of the 52 weeks in the year, the weeks off. So I like to, with most of the clients I work with that also have jobs on top of their training, think of their year as phase 1, phase 2 of the year, where they have one big goal for the front half. Maybe it's 100K mountain race, and then one big goal for the back half. Now, if you have good general fitness, don't be afraid to sign up for a 100-mile race that's 12 weeks away, right?
Right.
If you've done a bunch of 50 milers, 50Ks, you're feeling pretty good about yourself and you're really interested in the 100-mile distance, and it's 12 weeks down the road, if you take care of your body and you're not coming from couch to 100-miler, you can get it done in 12 weeks, right? We oftentimes also go overboard. Like I myself sometimes go overboard where I'm like, all right, I've got 20 weeks and I'm not going to run any races between here and the 100. I'm just going to focus on it. And I might go do a bunch of 50K to kind of 50-mile efforts just in training solo. But I think it's healthier for a runner to line up, test themselves at a 50K, line up, test themselves at a trail half marathon, right? Line up maybe 10 weeks, 12 weeks out, test yourself at a 50-mile race. I wouldn't recommend a 50-mile race any closer than 8 or 10 or 12 weeks. Like, I think that's a healthy amount of distance between the two. But most of the time for the 100-mile distance, I think 10 weeks out, like a 50-miler can be a great proof in the pudding. Where exactly am I at aerobically and from a durability perspective approaching this 100-mile race? That could be your most important long run for your 100. So personal experience, I mean, that's just been sort of the success kind of rate being the highest is a process oriented training approach like that.
Now let's throw the monkey wrench in, right? You've got an idiot like me that's going to do the Grand Slam. So how does that skew things? Like, what do we do in this case? Because and we're going to talk about the prioritizing of the races, as you kind of mentioned in our pre-show notes. But if we're going to take on something like the Grand Slam, we now have this really huge, right, magnitude of 4 100 milers in a very short span of time. The build plus that is going to take a lot more planning and prioritizing. So, what do we look at when we do something like that?
Well, I'd call you a very lucky man. I wouldn't call you an idiot.
I'm a lucky idiot.
You're a lucky idiot. You got into Western States, and it looks like we're going to get into 3 other really cool 100-mile races, all being extremely different, and all being on a really tight timetable. Me and you haven't done something like this. Me and you have worked together as athlete coach for UTMB and for Hard Rock.
Yep.
That's been really fun.
Yep.
We've worked together for Chattanooga, where you had a great run at Chattanooga against Paul Terranova, but we haven't stacked 100 milers. So first and foremost, what is this going to take out of your body, and where do we want to be heading into it? I think heading into it, if I could wish anything for you, it would be to be as fresh as you possibly could, because this is going to be a huge taxation. We don't necessarily have to be the fittest you've ever been heading into Western States, because we're not just running Western States.
Right.
We're running Western States, then 3 more 100 milers. And the gaps are really tricky, right? Vermont, we're talking 3 weeks. Leadville, we're talking, is that 5 weeks from that?
I think that's right.
And then Wasatch, we're talking another 4?
3.
Yeah. So yeah, this is quite tricky. And in the past, the tightest personally I've ever done 200 milers in proximity to one another is 6 weeks. Maybe 5 when I did Javelina into Solstice. And I think the mistake maybe that a lot of us make, especially if the first one didn't go the way we wanted it to, we try to reboot and do this additional training block between the 2 runs. But I think what's more important is to get the body back to full functionality and almost reverse taper into the race, getting as specific as possible to the next race coming up. So for us, we're going to get really good general fitness. We're probably going to do some half marathon leg speed work. You're probably going to do a trail half marathon, a trail 50K, a trail 50 miler, right? We need to, as one of your qualifiers for one of the races throughout the spring. You also are getting healthy again. So that keeps us quite patient. Whereas if you were firing on all cylinders in December, we would be booting up and we'd be training hard this winter and maybe starting to train hard a little too early. So I think for you, we could be quite patient through March, Aaron, and be in a state where you go into Western States a little fresher than most other people, but we also go into Western States prioritizing it. So for Western in particular, we need to do quite a bit of heat training, which is going to stick around and still be in the system for Vermont as well. Western States, you have the most net downhill, so we're going to need really strong quads. And it's a runner's race, along with Vermont. Both are runner's races. So I think that doing quite a bit of smooth downhill running, getting prepared for these events, not worrying too much about technicality, but going into the races, really strong quads, really strong glutes, ready to power hike a lot, prepared to power hike a lot, and having good aerobic engine are probably the most important 3, 4, 5 things, however I mentioned there, for Western States. Being heat trained on top of them are really important. And then we're looking at the latter 2 races where we're thinking, okay, like they get more technical as we go and more high alpine. We need to be prepared almost for totally different things. You'll be doing more hiking in those races sheerly because of the altitude and because of the technicality in the ladder at Wasatch. So as we get closer to those and you're maybe pretty beat up from 200-mile races, our reverse tapers are going to be really low volume and be a lot more hiking than the first few would have been, which makes sense too, right? You want to get to the starting line operational for all 4 of these races. So the first 2 are runners races, and we're going to be doing a lot of running for those 2. And then we're going to be battling the altitude, and then we're going to be battling the technicality. So that's kind of the general Bob Ross Pretty Little Tree picture I'm trying to paint here. But that is very generic when we're,
Sure.
we're talking about this on a 1 hour long podcast, and this is maybe a 10-minute segment. So there are intricacies of those training blocks, but that's the general picture, I guess.
And that's what we want to look at, is kind of, what's the overview, right? What's our outline? We get into those specifics as we kind of see how fitness goes. And, that's the great thing about coaching, is that we can change things on the fly, as we already have, and that's the wonderful thing about a coach athlete relationship, is the communication, right? Like allowing the coach to know where you're at, and the coach to allow the athlete what they're thinking and what we need to work on. So, it's, I certainly appreciate that. And, I can't stress enough to others that should be something that's foundational between, an athlete and their coach, is just the, ability to communicate, and for each to be heard, to have the coach be receptive to the athlete's comments, and vice versa, so that you're both on the same page and working towards the same goal. And so, speaking to the goals, we, when we talk about these things, I listened to a wonderful book today. It was a real short book, To Coach a Coach. It was a fantastic book. And then I just finished Steve Magnus's book, and both kind of harped on purpose, right? Like without purpose, there is no drive, and this whole adventure, I'll call it, is, it's not the extrinsic motivation of finishing the Grand Slam. It's, it has grown and it continues to grow, and finding that purpose, that's the thing that helps me want to get to the start line. And, aside from my goal of finishing this, I want to keep raising money for the Challenged Athletes Foundations, and the Vermont Adaptive, because that has grown into something more to me. If we look at each race individually, Western States, I'd love to earn that silver buckle, right? To go sub 24.
Definitely.
And I think the reality is I'm going to set up my splits to run a 21 to 22 hour race, so that I don't overtax myself, right? Could I run faster? Probably, but do I want to run faster? I think that's, the better question. Like, if I'm going to go to Vermont 3 weeks later, what is the thing that I can do at Western States to make, the next race the best possibility for success? So, if I put a 21 to 22 hour finish on there, it still gives me leeway in case something does go wrong to, hopefully get under 24. But at the same time, I don't think I'm going to tax myself too much, and looking forward. So if we look at each race, it's really just, what do I need to do to move on to the next one? It's hard because you don't want to look at the next race just yet, right? You want to focus on the race that's in front of you, which in this case right now, it's Western States, right? I want to focus on Western States, but I also have to be mindful of what's coming next. What's some things that I can do to think about that? In other words, like how can I better prepare myself to say, okay, I do need to focus on Western States, but I also have these three behind it. How do I not get so distracted? What's some good strategies you might say to someone in my situation, or in someone that's taking on something like maybe the B series here on the East Coast? What are things that people can do to prepare, but yet not, look past it too much?
Well, this is like anything in life, and we're all better at giving this advice than actually like engaging in it ourselves. But it's to stay present in the moment that you're in, but to also remember the tax of getting ahead of yourself in the first of the series, right? So the tax for you of maybe running your perfect day, let's call it 1930, 1945, 1845. I'm not sure, Aaron. You're quite a talented runner, right? So the tax of potentially running your absolute best time at Western States is, are you operational to start the weekend after or 3 weekends after at Vermont, right? So for you, I think setting up splits to run 21, 22 hours, it gives you the leeway that if the wheels come rolling off a little bit at mile 90, you have 2 hours to spare or 2.5 hours to spare. And you can hike it on in from ALT, right? You see how corner, you give them a high five, and you hike on out of there, right? But it also puts you in a position that you didn't overreach for Vermont. So I think the key here is not to only have a time goal for the first one for you or anyone else that's running the B series, like you said, or anyone else that's running the Grand Slam, but to also have some ancillary goals. Like I would like to average 24 hours for the series, right? Right under. I think that'd be a big goal. So you don't need to necessarily get way ahead at Western States of that goal. You probably just need to run around 21 or 22. Wasatch is, of course, going to slow your overall time down a little bit. I assume Leadville is going to be, 2 hours, hour and a half slower than Western States, right? Maybe 2.5. But Vermont could potentially be right around the same time or even a little bit faster. So the way I'd look at it is, if you have some ancillary goals for the entire series, like I want to run sub 26 at Wasatch, I want to run sub 24 at Leadville, and I want to run closer to 22 hours for, Vermont and Western States, that gives you a good scale of what am I working with for the entire run, right? And this could also be like the trilogy, like Eastern States, I'm forgetting the other two, World's End and
Heiner.
Yeah. I've Brad Wingler will maybe listen to this episode and be like, come on, man, you've coached this for me a couple of times. What's the first one? Heiner. Yeah. So, you could look at it in that way where you don't want to overreach at Heiner and you don't want to bomb the downhills, on super rocky terrain there, because you want to get ready for World's End. And it's it's a really tight spread heading into Eastern States as well, in relative terms for most people, the proximity of the 100K to the 100 miler. So I think that no matter what the series is that you're thinking of, and it could be a 6-day stage race like Trans Rockies, this is even tighter and closer proximity. You don't want to blow it on day one, because day 3, you're going to be hiking up Hope Pass, right? The highest elevation point in the course. You want to have good energy stores for that. So I think looking at the ancillary goals along the way a little bit, not to get distracted from the moment at Western States, but if you go in with ancillary goals on the other 3, that puts you in a good mindset on race day to not overreach, but still hit your goal of silver buckle, not bronze.
Right. Yeah. That's great. You started to talk about a little bit about kind of the reverse taper in between, so far as rest and recovery goes. Let's talk about some other things that, you bring into the picture. What are some things that you bring into the recovery picture? Components like nutrition, hydration, some of those things. What are some things that you suggest to folks for their recovery process?
Yeah, I can walk through the whole process, including describing the reverse taper a little bit more. Is that may be a confusing concept in general? I can remember being presented with it and saying, "What do you mean?" So we'll start there, I guess. The reverse taper. Let's call this post-Western States. So the way we look at it is we have 3 weeks, but we know that in order to be operational at Vermont, and for your endocrine to be in a good state, we're going to need at least 7, if not 10 days off from running. But for you, we are going to start loading again, probably on day 5 or 6 or 7 with some hiking, maybe even a little weighted hiking, even if it's just your pack, some bottles in there, getting out for 4 miles with a little bit of elevation change, right? We're not talking any running yet, but you are going to do some hiking at Vermont, right? There's a significant amount of uphill, downhill. So reintegrating a little bit of uphill, downhill, even if it is just hiking at day 5, 6, or 7 following Western States. Those first 4 or 5 days, we want to be completely off. And when I say completely off, like I know I drive my partner, my wife, like a little crazy after day 6 or 7. And it's like, so when is this like 10-day rest period over? But I mean completely off. I mean like playing a video game and just relaxing and taking time and, enjoying a few beverages, like, just chilling and hanging out, keeping your feet up. Now, I don't mean only doing that. In addition, I'm talking, let's do some mobility work with a rope, like Phil Wharton's activated isolated stretching protocol each day, not getting started on that too early, but maybe putting the legs every day in a 20-minute Epsom salt bath. If you're, fortunate enough to be in a financial situation to go get a massage, like maybe 3-4 days after your race, your muscles are ready for a light massage. Maybe 6 or 7 days after your race, your body is ready for a deeper tissue massage. This is going to help to reset you quickly for the next build. Getting on a foam roller, doing some active recovery, right? Now, active recovery could be a 2 to 3 mile walk every day with no weight following the race for the first 4 or 5 days to just get blood flow to those areas that have been extremely taxed in your first 100-miler of this huge series. So don't undervalue the 20-minute per mile walk on flat terrain following a 100-mile race. I think getting blood flow to those areas is important. And like I said, follow it with some mobility, follow it with some self-therapy, whether it's a massage gun or foam rolling, follow that with an Epsom salt bath. That's a really good protocol for your first 4 or 5 days. So let's talk day 6 or 7. For you, that's a little more critical because we only have a 21, 22 day gap, right? So we don't want to lay off too much because your next race is coming up and we don't want to shock that system. So around days 6, 7, 8, that's where you get into, Aaron, like turning those flat 2 to 3 mile walks into some hikes with, let's call it 50 feet a mile or 60 feet, 70 feet a mile of rolling terrain hiking on single track. Starting to envision now, okay, my endocrine system isn't feeling quite as taxed. I don't feel like I need to sleep 10 hours a day. Now I can be in a position where I'm getting back out on the type of terrain that I'm going to be experiencing at Vermont. Now we're at day 10, right? And let's say this is our first kind of test run. We're just talking 4 to 5 mile test run, like nice and easy through relatively rolling terrain. This first run could even be on flat terrain. Maybe test run 1, flat terrain, test run 2, closer to 4, 5, 6 miles through a little bit more rolling single track. Then you kind of know, how am I feeling on flat terrain? How am I feeling on single track or rolling dirt roads? And then we gradually build from there throughout that week. So we have kind of like a 4 or 5 day training week where maybe by the end of the week, we get closer to 8 or 10 miles on that Sunday. So that's technically 2 weeks removed from your race. Maybe you see your first 10 miler. So we have then just 7 days till the race, right? So this is a gradual, right? Yeah. Now we're just 7 days from the race. So that week, we are maybe doing like a power hike or 2 on the treadmill, right? Like we're getting ready for the terrain. Maybe we do 8 miles and some strides like on that Wednesday, maybe just 3 or 4 miles and some strides on that Friday. And geez, you're racing on Saturday. It's kind of a wild reverse taper because you didn't really run much in between the two events. Sure. But look, you got a 10 or 12 miler in, right? You got, a few days of lighter strides in. And look, your fitness has not faded. Your fitness is there. The most important thing is you're operational enough to get out for an hour to an hour and a half on trails and you felt good about it. That's all the time we have, right? Yeah. So it would extrapolate, and that reverse taper would look a little different if it was like 6 weeks. So I've done it in such a way where it's that same exact protocol for the first 21 days, but then I had 3 more weeks between when I did Javelina heading into Brazos Bend in 2019. So for you, it might have only been a 25-mile week between for the reverse taper, but for me, it was the same. It was like 0 miles, 25 miles, 45 miles, 60 miles, and I actually got a 70-mile weekend before I tapered again, right? You don't necessarily need to get in another training block or a huge long run in between. You just need to be operational on the starting line. So right. I think when you're on a 3-week spread, if you feel good on trails for a 10 to 12 mile run, it's enough.
Right on. Yeah. You touched on having, massage and, some of these other ancillary things, but that got me thinking. And one of my questions was, we oftentimes try to create a team around us, for something, it can be for, again, for anything in training. But when you look at that team, who are some people that you like to have on it? Because we don't want to create this huge, massive team, but we want to have some particular people on there that we can count on. who would that be to you?
Yeah. So from a motivational and guidance perspective, Magda Boulay for Western States 2019, most of my 2019 year. And then in more recent times, Ian Sharman, they've just been invaluable resources. Ian has been there for me, like motivationally in the last couple of years, just structurally giving me like so many ideas that I wouldn't have given myself. Like, hey, it's important to reestablish some leg speed, but also giving me like the emotional guidance during times where I'm not super motivated to run and train at the level that I was years ago. So Ian has been an invaluable resource in that way as a coach, right? So I think the most important thing is selecting a coach, someone that you know is in your corner, that is going to provide you with sound guidance, that is in it for the long haul and isn't trying to get as much out of you as possible from a marketing perspective, right? Like,
Sure.
wow, I can get this athlete to achieve insane things. We can market that and we can get other clients because of this athlete's success. So, you know, the way I look at it is I want runners that I coach personally to enjoy running 10 years from now more than they do right now, right? That's like the baseline of my coaching philosophy. So no matter what, even if it's sacrificing race performance for this small block of time while they get healthy, like we need to give them time to get back to a good physical or mental state in order to still be in the sport 10 years from now, right? That's always been my goal, whether it's collegiate or post-collegiate or in ultra running, right? So I think I have chose to select people that are friends that I also respect a lot as coaches, like Ian and Magda, to be there. So small team of like one coach, one advisor, getting you ready. Like that's kind of the beginning of the hierarchy there.
Sure.
In addition, like, hey, like have a great partner, have a great person in your life that, you know, like that is there for you, whether it's partner, wife, husband,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
That is an extremely important aspect to me of just feeling like running isn't the only thing and we're in each other's corner. And this is, you know, I'm on this adventure with this person. Right.
Yep.
And then, like you said, massage therapists. Like, so my friend David Howard's been my massage therapist for 6 years and he's just been awesome. He's a healer. Right. So I've chose to stick with one person that has really got to know my body and keep me, you know, in a good state in that way. In addition, for me, like Phil Wharton has been a good friend and someone that has helped me through times where like I was really struggling at, say, hamstring origin after comrades. You know, Phil kind of came into my life at that point, and his activated, isolated kind of stretching protocol has been really big for me to just keep me like, you know, in the sport. So those are a few of the core components. And then we can kind of branch out from there from like, do you also have time for a physical therapist? Do you also have time and money for a nutritionist, right? Do you also have time and money for all these other bits, right?
Right.
So, you know, I worked a bit with Will Benitez, who's he has a business called On Pace Wellness, and Will's been a great, you know, nutritionist to kind of look at like the last like 7 days and help me design a program based on, you know, inside tracker kind of blood levels, like where I'm at, in order to get me more operational before my race. So you can have a big team there, but let's just talk your daily team, things that like don't fiscally cost you, right? I think having a good training partner or someone that keeps you accountable is really important. So for me, like Kaylee Demerjian's a big part of like me getting out the door every day and wanting to continue to train. Like Kaylee lives right down the street from me. I've been coaching her for years. Now she lives in Savannah, and having someone in your life that maybe gets you out the door and keeps you excited about running, like a training partner can be very important, right? Yeah. Separate from, of course, like your life partner, but also like a really like someone you see every day, right? That becomes one of your best friends. And it doesn't have to be someone that is even exactly at your level in terms of like performance to it could be someone that you just go and do their hard days with, which are your easy days, right?
Yep.
Like someone's tempo could be your recovery day. So if you connect personally with someone, I think a training partner is invaluable as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you touched on a nutritionist or a dietitian. I know you're a big advocate of fueling properly. Do you want to touch on any key aspects that you think is really important, not only for something like I'm taking on, but just for training in general? It can be for any distance. Are there key components that you like to share with folks, especially in their recovery process?
Yeah. Do you also mean during the race, Aaron, as well?
We can get. I was thinking more like in daily aspect, or post race. We could have a whole conversation of in-race nutrition, I'm sure. But I was just thinking of, like the larger picture, right? What are some things that you would share with folks that these are some things that sometimes we don't think of, if we're looking at, nutrients and such. What are some key things key takeaways that you found that you would share to say, this is something that, it may be, a small thing, but it can have big benefits?
Yeah. So keeping a general intake that is consistent yet well-rounded and diverse is really important. I think the more that you could be eating with, local farmers and kind of eating with the seasons, that's going to help you to keep your diet well-rounded and diverse. So for example, like for years, we've done a CSA or shopped at our local farmers market. And that's like, hey, this is what's available this time of the year. And we kind of supplement from there, right? In addition to thinking about the sourcing, I definitely insist that people think about the macro and the micro. So when I say the macro, I mean carbohydrate, protein, fat. When I mean the micro, I mean, are you getting enough iron? Are you getting enough magnesium? Are you getting enough potassium? Right? Like, are you getting enough B12 because you're vegan, right? So there are a lot of things to be thinking about. From there, it's a matter of how much do you really want to be sourcing from primarily plant proteins? How much are you limited by, I am unable to consume red meats? Like, are you a pescatarian? You have to really think about then, like, where are you at on the scale? Like, for example, I'm a pescatarian, right? Like I just eat fish, and I primarily eat like vegetarian, vegan meals. So I think a lot about supplementing iron, paired with vitamin C to make sure I have enough, iron. My ferritin is at a good level. I also think a lot about supplementing calcium, right? And I also think about supplementing B12 because I'm not getting B12 from a red meat source, right? So that's a good starting place. This is why it's really good to do like a 7-day evaluation with a nutritionist and do a blood test to get a baseline of where am I at and how much could I improve? Because you might look in and say, okay, I'm a male and I've been here. I have my ferritin's at 34, right? I can't possibly perform at exactly optimal levels, but all my best races, I've never been above 45 or 50 for ferritin, which is like surprisingly low, right? Compared to, in order to be operational, the industry says like 65 is the magic number. Like, I don't know if I've ever been at 65 for my ferritin, right? So from that perspective, like each person is different, but doing a blood test on a semi-regular basis will help you to know like how good of a job am I actually doing. In addition, like developing a consistent program is really good. Like I know I operate really well off of a small snack and a small snack like a stroopwafel with some nut butter on it, maybe a banana, cup of coffee, go for a run. Like that's like first breakfast. We're talking Hobbit meals here. Then second breakfast, you come back and maybe I do like a protein based smoothie with like a 4:1 ratio. Getting 400 or 500 calories in before I clean up, do some mobility, some strength. Then I have proper breakfast, your second breakfast, like your Hobbit meal here, right? So a lot of distance runners may benefit a lot from having 4 or 5 meals, but in there it becomes precarious. Like, okay, calcium was a little too close to iron, which is going to interfere with absorption, right? This is why it's really important to have a nutritionist that helps you plan, when do I take my iron each day, right? When do I take my calcium each day? Like, when do I take the micronutrients that aren't interfering with each other? In addition, you need to be thinking about the macro, right? So protein, fats, extremely important to get into your body quickly after running. How late into the evening do I want to be eating? How am I going to fit all these meals in? Am I calorically getting enough? So there's a lot going on here. This is a big, broad question, but those are my main bits of advice, like consistent, well-versed and diverse in terms of your diet.
Excellent.
You also asked about in post to 100-mile races, right? And big efforts, Aaron. So what I'd say in post is remembering things like gluten is a digestive irritant, right? And I'm not encouraging you to not eat the things that you would like after a race, but I would definitely encourage you to, you need carbohydrate for the brain to operate like efficiently and well. It's the main fuel for our brains. So I think that, yes, it's extremely important to get carbohydrate after your race, but be careful about the sourcing so that you're not interfering with the body's ability to process a lot of that damage that's already been done. So putting in a digestive irritant, like very bready foods after a race isn't always the answer. Whereas like eating higher protein, higher fat diet following a race is a really good approach to make sure that you're getting enough fuel, you're getting enough calories, but you're also not pumping digestive irritants in, right? So maybe thinking about like getting your carbohydrate from more potato, rice, quinoa based carbohydrate after a race, as opposed to I'm just going to eat all my favorite pastries at this little deli, right?
Right. Oh,
I think about like, I'm going to eat an avocado every single day following a 100-miler, right? Like avocado with, corn chips, like, like with really good fats. Like I'm going to eat a lot of nut butter. I'm going to eat a lot of protein from like a yogurt source. So these are good places to start for us. But like I said, I'm not a registered dietitian. I've just gone through this process many times.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I appreciate that, and something that you've kind of touched upon throughout this episode and previously is incorporating much more than just the running, right? We're looking at, strength components. We're looking at mobility components, so that it's more of a comprehensive plan, right? We're looking at the functionality of the body so that, we have a reduced likelihood of injury. That's kind of the big thing. Even with all that, injuries do manifest themselves. I mean, it's such a repetitive behavior, especially within 100 miles. We've kind of got this motor pattern that we're producing time and time again. Injuries do happen. With that said, if something pops up, you kind of talked about how your return in your training, you came back a little too quickly and ended up on the bike. What are some things that, if injury does kind of manifest, what are some things that we can do to help us keep going? Aside from the recovery process, if we're looking to to at least maintain fitness, what are some things we could be looking at?
Well, first and foremost, see an orthopedic specialist, see a PT. We're not talking, like you said, we're removing that element, but we have to consider that element when we're considering what we can do, right? So like, let's say we have a problem in the lower leg, like maybe we want to do some rowing instead of biking, right? And really immobilizing like whatever joint has given us some problems in that lower leg, right? Maybe we want to do swimming because even rowing is too much of a taxation if that's an ankle or knee or hip issue and the rowing is too much, right? So we do need to analyze on the front end with a physical therapist or a medical professional, like what can we even do? Once we had established what we can do, like they say, yes, you can row or yes, you can ride a bike, but I'm concerned about you doing weight bearing training with running. Then you can ask, how about hiking? No, still no hiking. So, okay, let's just say like hiking and running have been removed. What can we do? Well, what do we know about the body, the human body? We work really well doing 45 minutes to an hour and a half of exercise a day. Okay. So what am I willing to do and what do I have access to? Well, I have access to a pool. I have access to a rower. These are good starting points, right? I don't have access to a bike. All right. So from that perspective, I think we can think consistent training to maintain 75% of our aerobic capacity by getting good at, being on these other ancillary sources, right? A rower or in the pool. Now we can add stimulus in there, right? We could do some aqua jogging. We could learn to do tempos in the pool while aqua jogging, or tempos on the rower. There are ways that we can still stay aerobically fit and apply some of the general training concepts to have almost a cross training block, to where it's not just spinning on a spin bike in zone 1 the entire time. So we can still add stimulus. Like we can do strides at the end of a session on a rower. Like mechanically, that's going to be totally different, but at least we're getting those nice little spikes and plateaus in heart rate, right? We're still not totally walking away from the core components of what give us the ability to shift gears, like late in ultras, right? So we can do a lot there aerobically. I think also doing things like maintaining core strength and working on some of our weaknesses are really good when we're not able to run. So maybe we want to do some power oriented activities in the gym, right? More like 4 to 6 repetitions. Like when we're not in a gigantic training block doing massive amounts of volume, that could be a really good time for us to work a little bit more on power development as opposed to muscular endurance work. And power development meaning higher weight, lower reps, muscular endurance, meaning like 12 to 15 repetitions of exercises. So that could be a really good time for us to maintain core strength, but also develop a little bit of power and maybe work on attaining a little bit more muscle mass than we're used to having. So there's a lot we can do when we're not able to run. It's difficult motivationally and mentally, though, to continue to train when you're not going to be able to run for a while. So maybe that was part of your question. I felt like that was part of your question. Yep. How do we stay motivated? Well, how much does it mean for you to return to running? And what state do you want to return to running in? You want to return to running in a decent aerobic state, quite fit, thinking about body composition and, okay, I don't want to gain a lot of weight during this time. I want to come back and be able to get back into training like as quickly as possible. So that could be your motivation, right? Harder to have training partners when you can only row, but maybe you have a really good friend that's willing to go aqua jog with you a few days a week, So if you totally lose your training partners, maybe you could encourage someone to come with you. And maybe it's your partner that has never aqua jogged before, right? Like maybe you're like, hey, you want to come do this with me? Maybe we can go swim together. So keeping community involved is really difficult when you're injured, but maybe there's someone that is willing to support you in that way, and they could improve their body composition as well. So.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, I mean, I was just talking with Fanny Barrett about the Grand Slam that she did this year, and it becomes a mental strain too. Not just a physical strain, but you're just exhausted mentally. So so with that, that said, having training partners that, can be there and continue to motivate you and be a part of, your training, I think is a huge aspect. But aside from, the benefit of training partners, what are some other things that, you've done when you've been in that kind of mental low? Because I'm sure it comes, with training. It's a hard thing, and I'm sure it's going to hit me at some point that I'm just exhausted, and I'm going to have another 100-miler break, coming up. So, what are some mental tips that you have?
Yeah, when you hit a bit of a low, leaning on your community a bit to sometimes get you motivated and out the door is great. But what if you don't have that, right? What if you don't have a training partner? How do you stay motivated? Well, to a degree, you have to give yourself some flexibility. Like an off day isn't a bad thing. Not like 20 in a row is not great, right? When you're training for something and you're on a tighter timetable. But I think regular off days can be beneficial. it's not always the answer to just be a run streaker. I think some of the best years of my running career, I was a 2-day off a month kind of runner, right? And those kept me going and kept me excited, where I was reminded on a regular basis, like what it felt like to take an off day. So in order to maintain motivation, I think play with different methods. Like maybe you should just be running 6 days a week. Maybe you should be running all but 2 days a month. Play with like different waves there. And I think as runners that are used to grinding as a habit, grinding is a little bit of a habit for us. When we take a day off, we realize, oh, I don't like this very much. Like I can't wait to get back to it tomorrow. So play with the frequency a little bit when you're in those low patches. Like maybe it's 5 days a week and that's okay. I think when you're going through lows like that, like taking a day off can help. Don't make it a pattern, but it can fire you up for the next training build. So off days have always been really helpful for me in that way, where I don't necessarily like the way I feel, when I'm not running. Right. And I've been taking a big chunk of time off here from Javelina. I'm ready to get going again. I'm really excited about the next training build. So when you're on a tight timetable, give yourself, be forgiving, I guess, and give yourself some flexibility. But if it turns into a problem for 4 or 5 days and you're like, I still don't feel motivated, then maybe it's time to, speak with someone. Like I think a sports psychologist could be really valuable for someone that's struggling with motivation to run. And I think that even if you have good friends that aren't your everyday training partners, use them as a source of motivation and talk to them about your struggles with like, I just don't feel like running right now. What do I do? Yeah. So it's a combination here of the mental, physical, of like play with the frequency of running in order to find your personal rhythm for staying motivated to run. Right. And don't just stick to the same things that have always worked, like play around with 5 days of running a week, 6 days of running a week, all but 2 days of running a month. Like those are good beginner spots to stay motivated.
And it's a good time to kind of reanalyze your purpose, right? Like we talked about purpose earlier. But if you don't remind yourself of your purpose and why you're out there, a lot of times that can, you lose sight of what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, and why you're trying to do it, right? So remind yourself of that purpose, and is it still strong, or does it need to be changed, enhanced? What's going on there? That's a good time to reevaluate as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, struggling with purpose is part of being a human, an adult. It's why people change careers. It's why we change like our goals within endurance athletics. Like we all go through it. You've gone through it. I've gone through it. Like at some point we have to change our purpose, and you have to play with the balance. Like, for example, we're both runners and coaches. Sometimes we're more of coach than we are of athlete. Right. And sometimes we're more athlete than we are coach. And that is constantly pivoting up and down. So just because you define as an ultra endurance athlete, that doesn't always have to come first. That could be second or third or fourth or fifth in the order. So play with where that's at throughout the year and throughout your career. And I think that it will be more sustainable if you play with that. Right.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Any last thoughts? Anything you want to touch on that we haven't talked about? Any parting words of wisdom?
Well, I mean, this is the Grand Slam, the Aaron Saft Grand Slam episode, right? So I'm excited for us to engage in this. I guess I'll turn that around to more of a question for you, Aaron, where, I know you're really excited for this. You've been talking about getting into Western states for years, and I'm just excited to be a part of the adventure with you. And I'm just wishing you health and high levels of motivation throughout our training block here, our large training phase, I guess, for this adventure. So more than anything, we have to keep the fire running hot. I want to turn the question around. How excited are you for the Grand Slam personally?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I'm gonna have a hard time not getting emotional, but just the the outpouring of support that I've already been shown. It's like if I go out for a run, I have a hard time not thinking about what's going on and how many people are behind this effort. Like I've already raised over $6,000. Like that's incredible. It was like 2 weeks ago that I started this. And just seeing, the people that are in my corner. I know that I have people to rely on and talk to. I've got a great team. So my excitement for this experience, because as you said, I've been looking forward to this for years, and I'm going to do everything I can to get to the line healthy. And it's not hard to find motivation in any regard. Anywhere I turn, my kids know what's going on. My wife knows what's going on. They're all on board. I have that support of you, of my family. My parents are behind it, and I mean, the people that that want to come out, it's incredible. And, I've been reaching out to folks about the other races, and they're all there for me. They're all like, yes, let's make this happen. So, when we talk about community, I feel that community, and it's an overwhelming sense of joy and happiness. Like, it doesn't give me a hard time in finding purpose, and knowing that each run I do brings me one more step closer to towing the line and being ready for this adventure. So, I as you said, I got to stay present. I can't get overexcited. I can think about Western States and when my foot first touches the track in Auburn, and like my heart rate will jack up because I get excited, about that prospect, but I can visualize it, and, it's just making that a reality. And so how do I do that? I just have to be patient, trust the process, do all the things that I can just to make sure that those legs can carry me, that 99.9 miles to that track and, let me set foot and come around the track, and then do everything I can for the next one, so I'm overexcited by the possibility, and I am, I can't believe I have the opportunity. As I said, for UTMB and for Hard Rock, I can't be more, more thankful for the opportunity. Like I realize what this opportunity means, and not many people, get to do this. So knowing that, and, recognizing that great gratuity for this, that's huge. I don't for a moment, take for granted that this is a wonderful opportunity, and it's because of so many people that I have this opportunity. And so I just want to thank everybody for that.
Yeah, I love it, man. We're going to have to find a leather worker that can do up 4 really nice belts for your buckles. And we're going to have to keep all those on the docket there for you. No, I'm super excited for you, man. I think that this is going to be a really special experience. I know Morgan Elliott's in your corner, and your family's in your corner. Like I'm coming to one of these, to come support you. And I'm really excited to be there and do some pacing for you. I think the longer that you're involved in ultra running, you look forward to support as much as you do racing yourself. And I know you've always been that type of guy that you love to go support the athletes you coach. Right. So dude, it's time for your community to give back to you too, and be there to support you. Like, I mean, I'm not at all surprised that you've raised a ton of money already for adaptive athletes. Like you're a pillar of our community on the East Coast, and not only through your podcast, but just the person you are. Like, I mean, everybody's excited for you, man. I can't wait to be a small part of that adventure. So
no, thanks, man. I do appreciate that. And let's just end on the fact that I'm grateful for you, and I hope others can share in your wisdom. So how can they connect with you?
Yeah. So I have a platform, patrickreaganrunning.com. And on there is a coaching page where you can put in requests to work with myself, Nicole Manette, or Randy Taylor, who is my team. That's my current team of coaches. We're all super good friends, and we all have availability for 2023. So if you'd like to engage in either a consultation or coaching services, you can reach us there. And if you just want to reach out, something here, you personally connected with, and you have a question, I have my social media. I run only Instagram, just Patrick at Patrick Reagan Running. So if you'd like to reach out, you can reach out or follow there.
Awesome, man. I'll have all that in the show notes, along with a lot of the stuff that Patrick was mentioning throughout the episode. I really like the Whartons and their active isolated stretching. So I'll share a link there so that people can check that out, because it's a great mobility exercise. So thank you for everything, Patrick. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and giving us this great wealth of information that you just so gratefully gave us here. It's there's so much that you went through here, and it was wonderful. So thank you.
I'm happy to share. Yeah, I'm always happy to get behind a camera and chat with you too, Aaron. So it's a pleasure being on, and look forward to next time. Well,
Patrick, thank you again for the time, for sharing so much knowledge with all of us. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I took away a number of things. I was taking notes as Patrick was talking of things that I want to remember and incorporate and do. So thank you. I really appreciate you, buddy. As to everything else that's going on here, oh my goodness. We're right before the holidays, which is insane. I can't believe they're here already. So I hope you are enjoying your holidays and sharing time with your friends and your family. If you're thinking on next year's goal and such, please be thinking about your purpose and your why, as we kind of talked about in this episode. Write down what is going to set you on fire. What's going to make you passionate about training. Think about those things. It's a huge thing to take on. I mentioned, and I have mentioned multiple times, Steve Magnus's book, Do Hard Things. And, he talks a lot about all of these things within the book. So if you haven't read that one, I highly suggest it. So far as things go here, well, man, aside from the holidays, we're in full swing with coaching. And training. I'm so glad to be back to it. So things are going well. If you are thinking about training for something and would like to have that coaching conversation, either with myself or with Patrick, again, our contacts are in the show notes. Patrick is a wonderful coach, and I'm happy to have that conversation as well. We're two different coaches and do things slightly differently. So, having conversations with multiple coaches and finding the one that's going to work best for you and the way you work is a great thing to do. So have those conversations. And then, as always, I want to thank you guys. As I said in this episode, I want to thank you guys for your generous support and donating to the causes. I'll put those causes again in the show notes. Again, I'm raising money for the Vermont Adaptive, for the Vermont 100, and for the Challenge Athlete Foundation for Leadville 100. While I have reached the goals that the races have set forth for me, I would love to continue to raise funds for these athletes. It's such a great cause, creating opportunities for athletes, that may not know or have those opportunities. So, if you can donate, I greatly appreciate that, and I hope you'll consider it. So, again, I'll put those links in the show notes, and I thank you all for your generosity and for support. It really does mean the world to me and to these athletes. So thank you. And so I want to say, at this time of year, that I'm just grateful for all my friends, for all the support, for, being able to continue this podcast. I will have my gear review next week. I was going to do that with Nathan Lehman, and I'm not sure of the possibility of that right now, so I may just do the episode by myself. But the gear review will be next week, so stay tuned for that. I hope you are doing well and continue to just celebrate your life that you're living right now, your happiness. That those mean the world. So please take a moment. Give your thanks, and until next time, keep running, my friends.